異變、不確定、複雜、模糊。喺呢個 VUCA 時代，現代人既要追趕 AI 經濟革命，又要喺兩極化社會入邊生存。挑戰越嚟越多，但係情緒先行嘅雜訊先至係我哋最大嘅敵人。點樣喺雜訊中保持清醒呢？提供事實而非立場，提供數據而非情緒，等你為自己作出決定。如果你認同呢種價值，請即訂閱我哋。2026年第一季未結束咧，世界上面嘅軍事衝突咧已經變得非常之多啦。尤其是我哋見到喺拉丁美洲入邊，委內瑞拉總統馬杜羅咧係喺美國嘅軍事介入底下被捕。同一時間，美國同埋以色列聯軍咧針對住伊朗局勢咧發起咗持續多日以來嘅空襲，至今咧亦都未平息。當中我哋都會見到咧，美國嗰個強大嘅軍事同埋空軍嘅能力咧，係可以繼續壓倒全球，而且快速地咧係擺喺拉丁美洲、中東咧，亦都係無所畏懼，亦都確立咗現時我哋以民主自由價值嘅西方價值咧，仲係喺呢個軍事上面咧擁有一個嘅比較大嘅優勢。但係同一時間我哋見到咧喺亞洲局勢底下咧，亦都有唔同嘅勢力喺度虎視眈眈㗎。中國今日已經建立咗全世界第一大嘅海軍，以數量嚟計呢係的確第一大嘅。以生產力嚟講呢，其實中國基於佢現時嘅生產力同埋製造到嘅武器，尤其是低層武器嘅措施，無論又平同埋數量底下呢，都係越嚟越多。究竟呢一種新型嘅軍事力量喺一個非民主地區嘅國家手上慢慢崛起嘅時候，會唔會危害到全世界呢？喺呢度呢，我哋就請到另一位嘉賓 Dmitri Alperovitch 咧，就同我哋一齊去分享一下究竟佢點樣睇。Dmitri Alperovitch 如果大家認識嘅話呢，好有機會呢，就係因為認識 CrowdStrike，因為佢同另一位創辦人呢，就係成立咗 CrowdStrike 呢間公司，亦都係全球最大嘅一間網絡安全嘅公司。而同一時間呢，佢除咗係做 CrowdStrike 之外呢，佢亦都係喺美國國土安全部啦做過一個嘅顧問委員會嘅前委員，亦都曾經任呢個國防部嘅特別顧問。現時呢，佢係喺美國國家安全智庫食拉多維政策加速器嗰度咧做緊創辦人同總裁。喺2013年嘅時候呢，亦都入選喺外交政策底下全球百大嘅傑出思想家。佢今日咧就同我哋一齊分享一下佢點樣睇中美之間，尤其是喺台海入邊嗰個軍事衝突同埋壓力。Thank you, Mr. Dmitri, for this interview that I think we caught you in a very interesting time that I think when the book published, no one thought about, maybe you think about, there will be war break between US and Iran, and also there is a military operation in the South America in the early this year. Those situations not only involve the US military, but also involve the air defense system from mainland China. What do you think about it? Is it the China military system is weaker than we thought, or there was another problem that happens in Iran or Venezuela?
I'm not sure that there's a problem with the Chinese or even the Russian air defense systems. I do think that when they're facing the U.S. military, the most powerful military force that's ever been on this planet, they are not up to the task, because the U.S. has numerous kinetic and non-kinetic capabilities like electronic warfare to neutralize air defenses. This is a mission that the United States has focused on for many, many decades and is absolutely the best in the world at it. And what you saw both in Venezuela and frankly Iran, where we are in the process of achieving complete air supremacy over that nation, being able to fly unimpeded day and night over the skies of Iran, is a testament to that. So it's not that Russian or Chinese military equipment doesn't work. It's that, at least in certain cases, when confronted with the power of the United States and the capabilities of the United States, they come up wanting.
After this military operation, I think we have, not we, but the world and also the media have reassessed the military balance between the United States and China, especially when we talk about in Asia.
Well, the location of individual systems doesn't matter, but the scale and volume of those systems absolutely does, right? So China, of course, mainland China, has numerous systems, much more than Iran or Venezuela on air defense, so that presents a harder target. in general, when you sort of do military balance, sort of if you do a spreadsheet comparison of the United States military to the Chinese military, it's not even a question who is way, way more superior, particularly on the key things that matter to military operations, such as logistics, such as intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. It's not weapon systems that win wars. It's actually logistics. And China has nowhere close to the military logistics of the United States. It would not be able to perform an operation like Venezuela. It would not be able to perform an operation like Iran. But the problem is that wars aren't fought with spreadsheets. And the one conflict that the Chinese have been focused on, of course, now for many, many decades, thinking about preparing for building equipment specifically for that conflict, is the invasion of Taiwan. And there, they would do much, much better than they would, in military operations around the world. The United States has lost its focus at the turn of the century on that conflict and has allowed its capabilities in the region to atrophy while we were focused on prosecuting counterterrorism missions and Iraq war in the Middle East. And only in the last 5 or 6 years have we sort of started focusing again on the Indo-Pacific, on China, and building up capabilities, but we are coming from not a very good place, particularly when it comes to our munition stockpiles and our regional power projection. It is changing quickly, but we have more work to do. Now, I do believe that if the conflict were to take place today, which it won't, we're likely years away from any conflict over Taiwan, and hopefully it never takes place. But if it were to take place today, we would defeat China. I'm very confident of that today. The question is not, though, would we defeat them today, but would we defeat them in 4 years' time, for example, as they're continuing their buildup and presence in the region. And we have to ensure that we keep up with their arms race and produce more and more asymmetric weapons that can defeat the Chinese Navy and sink the fleet to the bottom of the Taiwan Strait should they decide to make a crossing.
But when we talk about the balance of power between the United States and China in the East Asia Sea, that will be another problem. When we talk about Taiwan, it is not that balance or it's not a fair game because United States have military all over the world. If there's logistic and there's focus, I think there's Middle East, there's scenario, there's also scenario in Russia and also in Ukraine war. But seems China take the offensive side will only have one target, can deploy every logistic and military and also the production power on military side on that. Do you think that nowadays the US have those military productions that can keep up with?
Yeah, of course, should there be a conflict, and hopefully there won't be, but should there be a conflict, that will be the only priority for the US military. This is why right now the US administration is going to Europe, for example, and saying, you need to build up your own deterrent vis-a-vis Russia because we may not be there for you. And it's not just a political decision of would we defend NATO or not defend NATO, but practically speaking, and we've been saying that for years to the Europeans, if we're in a conflict with China, everything we have in Europe that is relevant to the Chinese conflict will go to the Indo-Pacific. And should Vladimir Putin decides to take an adventurous path and test NATO, Europe will be on its own. It's just the reality of the fact that we only have capacity to fight a one-front war. Even if you look at Iran, over 50% of our air power today is deployed over this conflict with Iran, right? So, not only could we not take China and someone else at the time, we really can't even take Iran on and anyone else at the same time. That would be a significant military fight. So it's not so much that our forces are dispersed. We can mobilize them quickly, as we have just done with Iran in a little over a month. We've brought all those logistics halfway around the world and are executing this campaign. So that's not so much the issue. The production capacity is a problem. We cannot outproduce China, in large part because we have allowed our military industrial base to atrophy. There's a huge effort and an enormous focus from this administration to rebuild our defense industrial base, particularly using advanced manufacturing, using robotics, using automation. So we're not sort of trying to match one-to-one the Chinese labor force, which we obviously can't. We're a much smaller country. But leveraging automation, leveraging technology, can we produce both high-end, highly exquisite and expensive and highly capable munitions and weapon systems, but also the low end? And this Iran war is actually a demonstration for the first time of those low-end capabilities, where we actually had taken the Iranian Shahed drones that Iran had sold to Russia and Russia deployed against Ukraine. We had captured some of those drones, reverse engineered them, and basically produced a very similar capability called Lucas that we're deploying now against Iran. Very, very cheap drones that can hit en masse against Iranian air defenses and other targets. So that is an example, an early example of some of those capabilities where we can produce lots of cheap munitions that we would need in a conflict. And look, the reality is that China is the one as an invading force that is attempting to do the hardest military operation that you can possibly imagine, an amphibious invasion, is at a disadvantage. The defending forces of Taiwan, of the United States, of Japan and Australia that might join in this fight have an advantage because they're defending territory. They can use standoff munitions to target Chinese ships. And this is really the point of weakness, right? So for China to win this fight over Taiwan, it has to invade with enormous force, probably at least 1 million, maybe even more people that it has to carry over the Taiwan Strait to land on Taiwan and occupy and pacify that country, that nation. And if the United States with allies manages to sink that fleet, it's over, right? There will be no lift capacity to carry those troops, and it doesn't matter how many rockets and missiles you have, you will not be able to occupy Taiwan. So as long as we focus our efforts on the Chinese Navy, also on of course on air defense against their missiles and aircraft, we are capable of inflicting enormous casualties on the PLA that would prevent them from succeeding. And the goal here is not just to defeat them. You know, as I write in my book, there are 3 scenarios here. China invades and wins, a disastrous scenario, certainly for Taiwan and the world. China invades and loses, still a disastrous scenario because of the enormous loss of life, huge economic damage that would ensue. And the Goldilocks scenario that we are trying to achieve, which is China never invades because they've been deterred. Unfortunately, to have successful deterrence, you have to convince the opponent's side that you're ready to fight and you have the capability to win that fight. So as much as we don't want war, as much as we would like to avoid it, we have to project confidence that we would fight and that we would win this conflict in order to make sure it never happens.
When we talk about deterrence, there's this important part about the propaganda and also intelligence and also the narrative that we talk about in China. But the problem is China is not a transparent world. They are not tapping to the international news and also seeing CNN, and also they have their own media system, especially also sometimes in Taiwan, that people are looking into the Chinese media, that they are scared that they may lose the war. That's why they surround without fighting. So this is one of the problems that happens in Taiwan now. What do you think about this, the deterrence effectiveness in the PLA nowadays, especially when there is a lot of high-ranking officials was sacked because there's a corruption involved and also there's losing the power structure. The deterrence, will that work in your scenario?
So we're not trying to deter the PLA. We're trying to deter one man, because what has happened in China since 2012 is quite remarkable, because Xi Jinping has achieved more power than any Chinese leader really since the emperor time. Even Mao, except for a very brief period of time, did not have as much power as Xi Jinping has now consolidated in his hands. So should there be a decision to go to war over Taiwan, it'll be a decision of one man and one man only, Xi Jinping. So that is who we need to deter. It doesn't matter what Chinese generals think, what the Chinese population thinks. It matters only what one person thinks. And I think we can deter him because he knows that the costs of this war, should he lose it, would be enormous for him personally and for even the survival of the Chinese Communist Party in mainland China. Because if you think about what it means to lose a war, It means probably the destruction of the Chinese Navy. It probably means hundreds of thousands of casualties in China, and something that would be very, very difficult for him to survive, both in power and potentially even with his life, and would put in danger the entire regime. So the stakes are very, very high for him. Before he goes, he needs to have a high degree of confidence that he can win this. And the more that we can impact that confidence, the more that we can make him wake up every single day, as I write in my book, and say, today is not the day, and prolong this as long as possible, hopefully beyond his tenure. Maybe there's a chance that whoever comes after Xi Jinping would not be as adventurous as other Chinese leaders had not been, right? Every Chinese leader since Mao has talked about the unification with Taiwan, but they were willing to push it off into an undetermined future. No one was rushing to do it. It's Xi Jinping that came in 2012 and said, we can't let this conflict fester for generations. The rejuvenation, as he says, of the Chinese nation depends on unification with Taiwan. He is the one that accelerated the military buildup. He is the one who's impatient. He is the one who we know has given the order to the PLA to be ready to invade Taiwan in 2027. Doesn't mean that he's invading in 2027. In fact, I think it's very unlikely that there will be an invasion in 2027. But he's clearly preparing his military and the political system with the purges that he's orchestrated to remove anyone that he thinks might not be executing his orders appropriately, is engaged in widespread corruption, or may not be as loyal as he needs to be. He is the one that's sort of preparing this battlefield for this war. And if we manage to extend the timeline beyond his tenure, beyond maybe his life, we might get a different leader who's not as obsessed with Taiwan as Xi Jinping is.
So let's talk about our failed case, but not in Asia, but in Europe. I think that's similar that when we talk about Ukraine and the Russian war, the deterrence is only against one person, is Putin. But United States or maybe the West failed this case. Why that happened?
Well, it didn't fail because we didn't try it, right? President Biden, at the outset of that conflict back in December of 2021, actually declared that the United States will not send its military to fight Russia over Ukraine. So it was obvious to Putin that should he invade Ukraine, maybe he would face sanctions, maybe he would face sort of military weapons supplies to Ukraine, but he would not face the United States, and as a result, he would not face NATO. So it's not that the deterrence has failed, it's that we didn't try it. And we didn't try it for a very simple reason, because successive U.S. presidents, starting with President Obama, who was very explicit about it, basically declared that Ukraine matters a lot more to Russia than it does to the United States from a strategic perspective, right? That is not the case with Taiwan, because successive U.S. presidents have focused on Taiwan not falling into the hands of China. This goes back even back to the 1950s, when President Truman was willing to go to war with the mainland should they attempt to invade Taiwan. We have a Taiwan Relations Act that was passed in Congress in the late 1970s that obligates the United States to provide capabilities to make sure that Taiwan can defend itself. And President Biden, on at least four occasions, has proclaimed that he would send forces to fight for Taiwan should China try to invade. Now, officially, we have a policy of ambiguity with regards to whether we would or would not go to war with China over Taiwan. But nevertheless, even when you look at President Trump, the main focus of his Department of War is actually not Venezuela, it's not Iran, despite the operations that we're doing, it's China. And in their public statements, when they're talking about the military budget, when they're talking about building new capabilities, it's all about China, China, China. So we are focused on deterring China. We are building up massively our bases and presence in the region, beefing up our presence in Japan, in Mariana Islands, in Guam, in the Philippines, and helping the Taiwanese with an unprecedented, the largest weapons sales package ever that we announced back in December. So there is a lot of focus on trying to deter China in a way that there was not with Russia and Ukraine.
So then we talk about the timeline then. You have mentioned in timeline that in the book that 2027 is one of the crucial time that China may take on Taiwan for the war and unification. And also this timeline maybe there is a window and also there's a gap. For example, when the military balancing between the United States and the mainland China is widening, so will there be any time that beyond these years China will never catch up with United States military power, or in the other way around, the military balance between these countries are narrowing, so that there will be a time exactly so challenging that because the military power between them is so small that China may take the risk.
So let me be very clear. I do not think there'll be an invasion of Taiwan in 2027. I think China's not ready. I think that 27 is very much a symbolic deadline that he's given to the PLA, because 2027, of course, is the 100-year anniversary of the establishment of the PLA, and two, it is the year of his very likely re-election for the unprecedented fourth term as Chinese Communist Party leader in the fall of that year. So I think it's very powerful for him to be able to go in front of the Chinese Party Congress in October or November of that year and proclaim that he, Xi Jinping, for the first time in Chinese history, has built a military capable of taking Taiwan at a time of his choosing. Whether he would actually build it, I think is very much in doubt, because they're behind in their modernization efforts. But it would not stop him, I'm quite confident, from proclaiming that he has done it, given that he's given them the order. But 28, I think, is a crucial year, mostly because, of course, there are elections in Taiwan in 2028, presidential and LY elections. And right now, I think the CCP and Xi Jinping in particular are putting a lot of their focus on that election and whether the KMT party that has become very friendly to China, particularly with the election of the new chairperson of the KMT that is visiting mainland China and talking to the Chinese leadership. They're hopeful that KMT can win those elections, and if they do so, maybe they're hoping. I think they're foolish to do so, but they're hoping that maybe the KMT will push for a peaceful unification. And after all, the preference for Xi Jinping, as frankly it was for Vladimir Putin as well, was to achieve their objectives without war. War is always the last resort. In fact, Clausewitz, the famous war philosopher, had proclaimed that the aggressors are always peaceful and that they would like to take over their neighbors unopposed, right? No one wants to go to war and take the risks because wars are uncertain if you can do it in other ways. So Xi Jinping absolutely will exhaust every option before he chooses invasion. So if there is a KMT leadership in Taiwan in 2028, then I think he'll give them time to see if he can achieve unification through peaceful means, probably a few years. So it may not be until 2030s before he actually goes for a military option. And I think the actual deadline here may be 2032, because in 27, assuming he gets reelected, which is almost a certainty, he'll be reelected to a 5-year term that expires in 2032. In 2032, he'll be 79. In the Chinese system, they don't tend to elect leaders into their 80s. And as we've just seen in our own U.S. election back in 2024, we've seen what happens to leaders that get into their 80s. They become frail physically, mentally. Who knows what kind of health concerns he may develop. So I do think he's thinking potentially that this term from 27 to 32 might be his last. Maybe he'll get another term after that, but it's not a certainty. And I do think he's very much focused on his legacy, on his how he's perceived in the Chinese history. He wants to be greater than Mao. Of course, the one thing that Mao couldn't do was take Taiwan. So getting that accomplishment would be an enormous boon to him in the annals of Chinese history. And I think he's thinking that, if this is going to be my last term, I need to get everything done that I wanted in that term, and Taiwan is at the top of the list. Again, he's going to try every way bribery, influence operations, coercion before he chooses war. But if all those things fail, and I do think they will fail, then he will seriously consider a military operation. It's not a certainty. And as I mentioned, the risks to him are very, very high. And there's a lot that the United States and Taiwan in particular can do to make sure that he never chooses that option. But the risks are high.
So then what about the trend of the production power and also the military power between United States and China? If those power is closing in 2023 or 2032, I think that will be a problem because the military power and the difference will be so small that they may take the risk. Or the military power nowadays is widening so that beyond certain times, there will be no chance that China will take on Taiwan.
So again, when we talk about military power, the details matter, right? So it is true, for example, that Chinese now have the world's biggest navy. It doesn't actually matter because the United States has a much more capable navy, despite the smaller numbers, than China, right? It has way more aircraft carriers, and every single one of our aircraft carriers, all 11 of them, are much more capable than any of the Chinese carriers, as one example. But the important thing here is actually asymmetric weapons. Again, China is at a disadvantage because it has to carry an enormous invasion force across the Taiwan Strait, some of the roughest waters in the world, land on an island that is effectively a natural fortress in terms of the defensive capabilities that could be deployed on that island. You've got very shallow waters near its beaches, very rocky beaches. You've got mountains, you've got rivers, you've got tunnels, a really, really complicated terrain for any invading force to take. In fact, we know this because there are only two countries in the world, in the entire world, that over the last 100 years have seriously considered and planned an invasion of Taiwan. China is one, the United States is the other, because in 1944, when Taiwan was, of course, occupied by Japan, we had developed a plan called Operation Causeway for the invasion of Formosa. 2 months after Normandy, 2 months after the greatest amphibious invasion in human history. And when we looked at Taiwan, the United States military planners at the time, 81 years ago, said, this is too hard. Even though we have just pulled off Normandy, this is more complicated than Normandy. It requires at least double the number of forces we used in Normandy. It is incredibly complicated, incredibly risky, incredibly costly. We're going to bypass Taiwan and we're going to invade Okinawa on the way to Japan, which is, of course, what we did. So even for the United States, 80 plus years ago, this was considered too difficult. And in the intervening 80 plus years, it's only gotten more difficult, right? And China very likely would not just be taking on the Taiwanese forces. It would also be very likely taking on the United States forces. And if the United States is in, Japan will be in, and Australia will likely be in. This is an enormous, enormous challenge for China. And while it does have a lot of military systems, it doesn't have more than the combined alliance. So not just the United States, but Taiwan, Japan, Australia, maybe even the Philippines. And the asymmetric capabilities that we are now very much focused on developing, ship-killing missiles and torpedoes that can sink that Chinese fleet, is really what matters. And particularly standoff weapons that we can deploy at huge ranges so we're not putting our own fleet in danger. That is the dilemma that China faces, is how to overcome that objective. And it's a really, really huge dilemma for them.
So then we talk about non-military force. Maybe it is military-like, but not that gun on the gunpowder things, but on the internet side. I think in the world, there's only two AI power is the biggest in the world. One, of course, is far leading is the United States, but another one is really big AI power is China. And also for the internet, for the technology, and also for the frequency use of internet spy or espionage, or even the internet attack. That's also from China. What do you think about this? Is that the unconventional way in the warfare? China, will they have the lead or will they have the case against Taiwan or in United States in this side?
Look, cyber is a formal capability for China. It's been focused on that capability for well over 25 years. But the United States is far, far leading in the sophistication of our cyber capabilities. We don't deploy them as China does. So we don't perpetrate economic espionage. We don't break into huge numbers of private companies and steal their intellectual property and trade secrets like China does. But we're very much focused on integrating that into our military capabilities. 15 plus years ago, we stood up a cyber command, a combatant command focused on integrating cyber capabilities into our military planning and capabilities. So that is something that the United States, I believe, is far leading China on. But, cyber is an enabler, right? Cyber does not win wars. It does not occupy land. It is something that is important and vital to enabling the kinetic forces, but it's ultimately the kinetic forces that win the fight. And one of the things that the United States is far, far better than China on is the joint integration of all of these capabilities, all of these fires, whether it's cyber, whether it's electronic warfare, whether it's all domains, space, maritime, land, air, than China. China still has done a very, very poor job of integrating its different services to act as one. We have focused on this really for well over 40 years. And have, of course, executed a huge number of wars, small and large, as a joint force, something that China has not done, right? Its last combat experience was in 1979 with its invasion of Vietnam, a war that did not go over well for China. There's literally no one now wearing the uniform of the PLA that has any combat experience whatsoever. Very, very different from the U.S. military that has literally fought a conflict, at least one conflict, every single decade since World War II. Not all of these conflicts have been smart to do, but it has given us tremendous experience that China lacks.
So then it comes to the last question that I think the question I think is not only on the China side and also on the US side, but also on the Taiwan side, especially when we talk about the rearming of the Taiwan military forces. Long ago, Taiwan enjoyed a peaceful time for decades, or many decades. So that I think that they are quite challenging in rebuilding their army and also the military power. So when there's war happen in the CrowdStrike situations, this is not China versus United States. This is China versus Taiwan, backed up by United States. What do you think about Taiwan? Are they prepared for this war?
Look, I think Taiwan has really dropped its eye on the ball, really over the last 46 years, since 1979, since the U.S. military left Taiwan and we switched our recognition to the mainland China. It's been complacent. It thought that war would never come, while the Chinese were undergoing the biggest military rearmament and modernization plan in human history. Taiwan ignored it, and now it's behind. It's severely behind. It's trying to catch up. It's purchasing more weapons. It's producing more weapons. Of course, President Lai has announced a special military budget that is very important to build up Taiwan's military capabilities. Your defense minister, Wellington Koo, is undergoing significant reforms to training, to mobilization of the Taiwanese military, but you're behind. And there's a lot more that needs to be done. Look, I actually think that when you look at the terrain here and the enormous difficulties that China faces with invading Taiwan, Taiwan should be able to defend this island all on its own. This is such a difficult place to invade, perhaps one of the most difficult in the world, that with a capable military, with an island that has a population of almost 25 million people, this should be impossible for China to do, even if the United States is not supporting Taiwan, right? But that's not the reality we face today, because Taiwan has dropped its eye on this ball, because it's coming up so far behind. It's not in a good place. It's getting better, and things are improving, but there's a lot more work to do before Taiwan is capable of defending itself without the help of the United States. And that's ultimately where I think Taiwan needs to be, right? So it's not a certainty that, of course, United States comes to Taiwan's aid. There are very few in the United States that are anxious for a military confrontation with China. China, of course, is a military, not just a military power, but a nuclear power. We have never fought a nuclear power before in the United States. The risk that the conflict over Taiwan stays conventional does not involve nuclear weapons is not zero. And Taiwan really needs to make sure that it holds its own destiny in its hands. And it is capable of doing so because it has such a huge advantage of terrain. It has a population, but it needs to do a lot more in building up its own defense industrial base. Taiwan, of course, is a manufacturing powerhouse. It is a technology powerhouse. There's no reason why some of the most advanced weapons in the world cannot be designed and produced in Taiwan, as Taiwan produces the most advanced chips in the world and microelectronics. You look at someone like Israel, right? That could be a great blueprint for Taiwan, a country that is capable of defending itself, that has become a regional hegemon because of its investments in its own military, that has allowed it to project power far and wide across its region, even though it's a small country, much smaller than Taiwan in terms of population, in terms of land. So Taiwan could be capable of this, but it needs to have the will and it needs to have the focus on this issue.
Thank you, Dmitri. I think that Taiwan should prepare. At least we don't want war happen, but at least we would do, we have to prepare. Thank you, Dmitri. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
喺呢度我哋好多謝 Dmitri 咧，同我哋一齊分享咗佢喺呢一個嘅書入邊，佢點樣去分析中國同埋美國之間新冷戰嘅關鍵嘅時刻，以及係點樣可以防衛到喺呢一個西方世界啦，同埋台灣底下，以防有其他嘅軍事介入嘅情況。如果大家想睇多啲關於 Dmitri 嘅著作嘅話咧，其實英文版大家可以睇到 World on the Blink。咁呢本書咧，其實就應該上年年尾嘅時候咧就推出嘅，而中文版不戰的勝算新冷戰關鍵時刻咧，其實亦都由一拳文化喺台灣2026年2月嘅時候咧就翻譯咗出嚟，咁大家喺留意以下嘅連結就可以睇到呢本書啦。唔該晒。